Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us. First of all, let's talk about the Never Is Now summit. Talk to us about some of the messages that we heard this year and sort of what distinguished this year's summit from past years.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me today for this timely and important conversation. And, for 6 years, since I started as ADL CEO, we've hosted Never Is Now, which has become the world's largest annual summit in anti-Semitism and hate. And I think there are a few things that characterize this year as different from prior years. So first, we're convening the conference virtually at a time when the dire threat of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish hate feels particularly resonant. One thing that's very clear from this year is that, unlike many other issues in sort of our public life, anti-Semitism knows no partisan bounds. We see that this type of prejudice can manifest on any end of the ideological spectrum. We saw this at the violent insurrection at the Capitol earlier this year, when men wearing Camp Auschwitz sweatshirts were rampaging through Congress looking for legislators to kidnap and kill. And we saw it, we're just literally dealing with the 3rd-year anniversary of the Tree of Life massacre at Pittsburgh, committed by a right-wing white supremacist. So we see a threat on the right, and yet we also see challenges from the far left. The reality is, after the fighting in Gaza in May, Jewish people were attacked in broad daylight. Their only crime, wearing a kippah, like on a street corner. But in places like Times Square or boulevards in Los Angeles, Jewish people were singled out and brutalized, again, in broad daylight. So that isn't new in some ways, in as much as conflict in the Middle East often can prompt anti-Jewish hate at home. But the level of brutality and the brazenness was really quite different. So that's a big change from previous years, I would say. I think the other thing that's really different this year than previous years is we've been talking about the challenges of social media for a long time. We had Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, as one of our keynote speakers one year, and he talked about it. We had Sacha Baron Cohen, the actor and activist, as a keynote. He talked about it. But this year, thanks to the work of so many important journalists and the whistleblower, the things we've been saying about social media and Facebook specifically are now indisputable, because we have evidence of their own research, their own documents, which put to lie the idea that they didn't realize how bad the extremism was. They thought they were really tackling hate speech on their platform. Truth is, it's far from it. And now, simply put, it's indisputable what they knew, and now we need to act on it.
Let's talk about that, Jonathan, because what does acting on it look like? And in particular, you referenced Facebook and misinformation. What does that look like to you? How do we get a step closer to, eradicating anti-Semitism?
Well, I want to be crystal clear about this. I think social media is a super spreader of, bigotry, but Facebook is really the front line, patient zero in the fight against prejudice. And I say this because ADL, we've been doing research on different forms of hate for decades and decades and decades. And we run an annual survey of online hate and harassment, and we see every year that Facebook, far and away, is the platform where people are most likely to be targeted. Jews, but also LGBTQ people, African-American users, Asian-American users, and so on. Last year, we organized the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, a coalition of civil rights groups that compelled companies like Coke and McDonald's and Starbucks, 1,000 of the most prominent brands in the world, to pull off of Facebook for the first time. And then we organized a walkout on Instagram that includes some of the biggest celebrities of our day, people like Kim Kardashian, Leo DiCaprio, Selena Gomez, and others. And we've gotten Facebook to make concessions. But what does change look like at scale? Well, I think it's clear that Facebook is somewhat immune from revenue pressure because of their sheer size, and fiduciary pressure because of Mark Zuckerberg's Class A shares that give him overwhelming control. So I think we now need regulatory pressure. We need legislators on both sides of the aisle to put aside their partisan differences and to take action. First and foremost, to reform the law known as Section 230, which exempts Facebook from any liability for the things that it publishes. To be clear, Bloomberg, if you said things on your podcast or printed things in Bloomberg Business Week or broadcast things on Bloomberg TV, you would be held liable, but Facebook is not. And so this loophole, Section 230, needs to be reformed and closed. Because the bottom line is that the founders, our founding fathers, when they wrote the Constitution, they imagined freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. Algorithms are not encompassed and are not covered by the Constitution. So I strongly believe that changing social media, reforming Facebook, holding them accountable starts by making them liable and susceptible to the same rules of gravity that dictate the behavior of all other businesses in media and every other sector of our economy.
And Jonathan, we know that the discussion around Section 230 is really one that has happened over a number of years. There's still a lot of debate over it. I know you did have Vice President Kamala Harris, though, speaking at the conference. If Section 230 is still something that's a little bit far out, what do you want to see in the short term from the Biden administration or from other lawmakers? I mean, is there anything more that they can actually do to crack down on hate on these platforms?
That's a great question. I'll give you three quick thoughts. Number one, in addition to Section 230, which I think is urgent, three quick things that could be done. Number one, we should simply outlaw algorithmic amplification of hate speech. Again, algorithms are not citizens. Their freedom isn't enshrined by the First Amendment. Algorithmic amplification of hate for the purpose of making money, that should be banned first and foremost. Number two, we should force Facebook and all the companies to make their data transparent. Simply put, you have the right when you ride a car to be able to look under the hood and understand how it works. These companies need to lift up their hood and open up their data so researchers and journalists and watchdogs can finally understand what's going on in these systems. Facebook said publicly that they believe their algorithms caught 88% of the hate speech. But thanks to the Facebook files and the revelations of Frances Haugen, this brave whistleblower, we know that their actually own research said they only got 3 to 5%. That's inexcusable, but we need to see the data. We need to see the numerator and the denominator. So number one, ban algorithmic amplification, or at least restrict it dramatically. Number two, force the companies to make their data available for researchers and the public. And number three, and finally, put a delay on live streaming content. We know that the shooter in Christchurch who murdered 50 Muslims in 2 mosques, the shooter in Halle, Germany 2 years ago, who tried to murder Jews at a synagogue while they prayed on Yom Kippur. We know in so many instances, content has been live streamed, but there's no natural law that says when I click post, something needs to be published automatically, instantaneously around the world. If you simply had, much like broadcast television has, a 3-second, a 5-second, a 7-second, and so on and so forth, a delay on live streaming content, that would allow the AI systems to catch the kind of content that is defamatory or that is actually inciting violence or broadcasting the kind of filth that, again, would be illegal on any other media. So slow it down, open up the data, and regulate algorithmic amplifications. Those are three things that the Biden administration through the FTC or Congress could do tomorrow that would make a demonstrable difference.
All right, Jonathan, we have to leave it there, but really powerful stuff. Thank you so much for joining us. Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO of the Anti-Defamation League. Thank you so much for your time.